Hey everyone. The only thing left for evolutionists to argue that the Earth is old is radiometric dating. And since it cannot get the dates of known ages correct, what makes us believe that it's reliable for rocks of unknown ages correct? Clearly, it is not only unreliable, but the fact that we know today that super heavy elements rapidly decay into stable radiometric isotopes that date millions or billions of years old, even though they were just formed, proves that radiometric dating is no longer evidence for evolution or anything else for that matter. It doesn't matter how consistent their decay rates become after it cools, because the early stages of their formation have shown us that they actually form rapidly from super heavy elements through the process of Z-pinch, where these elements are quickly fissioned and decay into subatomic particles, isotopes, and radioactive elements. Not only that, when they do form, they form in the arrangement of elements that matches exactly what we find on Earth's crust today, observed at the Proton 21 laboratories in Ukraine. Evolutionists claim that the Earth's radioactive elements came from material that evolved inside a star that exploded and the debris later formed to create Earth. But now we know stars cannot create any element above iron, so how could their theory be true? It can't. Evolution has been dealt its death blow regarding radiometric dating. But what about the Earth? They have been telling us that Earth's core has three main sources of energy, which are potassium, uranium, and thorium. If this is the case, then why don't we find more of it the deeper we go? Clearly, over billions of years, these heavy elements, like uranium, would be concentrated in the core. And if this were the case, then the oldest uranium would be at the core. And as it rises at the mid-Atlantic ridge, then logically, the closer you get to the ridge, the older the dating of the rocks would be. However, the exact opposite is true. The further you get from the ridge, the older the dates become. Now think about it. Over millions of years, uranium would have made its way into the core of the Earth. This would be the oldest uranium, as it would have taken the longest amount of time to get there. Then, it would have pushed its way up through convection at the mid-Atlantic ridge. Therefore, the further you get from the ridge, the younger the uranium would date. Since we find the exact opposite is true, and the further away you get, the older the dates become, this is an invalidation of that theory. And now they admit that experiments show that there is no uranium or thorium at Earth's core. So the idea of the slow geologic process and the dates along the mid-Atlantic ridge prove nothing in regards to how old the Earth is. This is best explained by Noah's flood. As when the fountains of the Great Deep broke forth and opened at this location, the water currents pushed away from it these radioactive elements, which settled into the newly formed rock layers. This also explains why 90% of the heavy elements uranium and thorium are on the crust of the Earth and not deep within the mantle. It also explains why lower rocks in the crust of the Earth date older than on top, since radioactive elements are dated older have more atomic weight. So we see uranium, which dates the oldest, in the lower levels because it weighs more, and the lighter elements on the top, which date much younger. So, if young Earth creation were true, then nearly all of the radioactive elements would be concentrated on the crust because of Noah's flood. If evolution were true and deep time, this would have allowed the elements to sink all the way into the core. What do we find? 90% of all radioactive elements are in the crust of the Earth. But if that's not bad enough, distribution is very uneven. 50% of all the radioactive elements are in Australia alone.
All the strange words make sense!
You see, Charles Lyell was a lawyer from England and a novice geologist, and he made up the geologic column that we have today. He did this with the intent of removing the biblical science from the education system, and it worked perfectly. Even though he made the entire thing up and admitted it, and Darwin took his work and expanded on it, the entire thing is based on a lie.
So here's the next question I had that I think is important. I've heard this being said by the critics quite a lot lately, Professor McQueen. So I'd like to get your thoughts on it, both you and George. So the critics claim that we cannot date rocks of known age because there's not been enough time for the decay of the parent isotope. And therefore, we would expect to get a wrong date. So in other words, they're saying that we shouldn't be looking to these examples of dates derived from rocks of unknown age because it's bad methodology. Is this just a rescue device, or what are your thoughts on this, gentlemen?
Yeah, it's a.
Can I just add a little bit to that? Well, Donnie, if that's the case, they should be giving a 0 date. If these things don't have the daughter elements, then they should be giving a 0 date.
And let me jump in here with one of my favorite comments. I never wanted to date rocks because I met Mrs. McQueen 50 years ago. I'd rather date redheads myself. But if you insist on dating rocks, you need to understand this diagram here. Remember that rocks, and I'll use RX for that, rocks are formed because of minerals. So let me hold it up to the screen here. You see rocks are formed of minerals. So actually what you're dating are the minerals inside the rock. The standard rescue device that the evolutionary community uses, Mount St. Helens erupts, or there's a lava flow in the Grand Canyon. And so when you go in to measure those minerals that I'm showing there, you're measuring minerals that are ancient. Even though the lava may have flowed out at in Hawaii, that lava, that basaltic lava, is going to carry minerals that have an old and give an old date. Now, there's quite a critique of that, but let's think of it like this. Let's imagine this pin here, as I move it across the screen, to be a motorcycle driving on the road in Hawaii back in the 1980s. And then let's pick up the Play-Doh and have the Play-Doh come over the top of this as a lava flow. So if we find a 1970 classic Harley Davidson inside this lava, what do we know? We know that this lava flowed out after 1970.
Yeah.
Because we got something we know that can be dated. So whether it's a motorcycle or a 55 Chevy that gets buried under one of these modern lava flows, it doesn't matter what the radiometric dating says. We know that it had to be after 1955 or after when the Harley Davidson was formed. And so that's one way to approach it. Now, exactly why the evolutionary community will say, oh, you guys at Standing Truth have not properly covered Isochron dating. You all have not properly covered the issue of this or that. These are rescue devices, which between now and Christmas, George and I can take a whole 2 hours on something like Isochron dating and show the problems with it.
John, just slightly on a different sort of line here. This is a question, can the rapid formation of coal beds, oil and natural gas assist in removing much of the heat produced during the global flood? This is that old question about, the heat problem, the accelerated radioactive decay and whatever.
Yeah. You'll find that all chemical reactions either give off heat or they absorb heat, or the structures produced themselves will take up the heat and convert it either into pressure or they'll convert it into movement. So despite the claim that the world would have got too hot, this is in the ignorance, not the absence, but in the ignorance of other mechanisms that can convert heat into other things. Now, you ought to be able to remember from primary school where your brother would get you poor innocent young girl with long pigtails, he'd get your hand and he'd do a Chinese rope burn. Now, all he's doing is actually moving his hand around you, but that movement translates into heat. Now, you haven't destroyed the arm, you haven't done anything, but you've actually removed energy. And you'll find the same sort of mechanisms, not just the heat itself, but the heat converts into all sorts of other things, chemical reactions, exothermic, endothermic, movement of rocks, etc. We actually watched one day a dike form as the water underneath our stratosphere just took off for reasons unknown to us, straight up through the sediments above. Now, that represents energy, represents movement, but it was all happening in the liquid itself, and it produced this massive structure that we would have said, that's a sedimentary dike. Must have been, yes, all the theories went out the window.
And we know from experiments, John, that have been done by the CSIRO on oil formation, and many others have done experiments on coal as well, that it takes roughly 350 to 400 degrees Celsius to actually create that oil. So, yeah, so the formation of the oil.
Can I interrupt you there?
Yep.
What they're doing there is taking the organic chemist and making oil the way he does. Right now, if you do what we've done, you simply, like we've run lots of experiments. You'll see some of them listed on our website, in which you actually take what's actually in the real world. So that if I go and I look at a coal field, which is my special area of interest, I find that the best quality coal, and I gave a paper on this to the Sydney Coal Basin Conference, right? Because our best coal has a certain percentage of high grade kaolin, fine microscopic clay scattered throughout it. You see, if you get too much clay, the coal, it ruins your sort of burning equipment you want to put in it. But if you actually have this stuff microscopically spread through it, it acts as a catalyst and it gets to coal without even being heat. You say, how do you know that? The answer is we use clay in pottery. And clay is used because it has one interesting property. As you cook it higher and higher, that soft white clay, all of a sudden it goes hard. And you can put it on the side and leave it, and it won't go back to being soft. So clay has an irreversible structure change as you raise the temperature. Now, the case of the clay that's in the coal, it's about 200 degrees. So I'll be brutally blunt. The clay that's in the coal tells us it has never been as hot as all the local flood experts want it to produce this vast amount of heat. It's a catalyzed reaction. And the same is true for the oil and the gas. We have made all three using simple clay experiments with no temperature emissions of any great significance at all.
So what about all those dating methods for rocks? I answered this question in my Crevo rant number 100.
Isaac is referring to radio dating methods. Now, this is a really complicated subject, so you're going to want to put on your thinking cap. Now, for you conspiracy theorists out there, a good quality thinking cap should fit comfortably underneath your tinfoil hat. However, if I may make a suggestion, not only does it guard against EMF, EMP, and unwanted government mind-reading technologies, it also doubles as a hard hat. Radio dating methods are based on radioactive decay. For example, uranium is a radioactive element. It's so heavy it's actually a little out of balance. So every once in a while it throws a particle off. This is called radiation. Now, uranium-238, for example, then turns into thorium-234. Thorium is the daughter element. But thorium is also heavy and unstable, so eventually it throws off a particle and turns into protactinium. Protactinium is also unstable, throws a particle off, and turns into another form of uranium, which then turns into another form of thorium, etc., etc. Eventually, all of this breaks down into lead, which is a stable element and doesn't turn into anything else. We can measure in a lab how long it takes for each of these breakdowns to occur. So, theoretically, we can take a look at a rock, examine the ratio of parent to daughter radioactive elements, and get a rough time scale and even be able to guess as to how old that rock is. But these radio dating methods invariably give ages of millions to billions of years. The Bible says the Earth is only 6,000 years old. So do these radio dating methods contradict the biblical account of creation and the age of the Earth? In short, no. Take, for example, the Uinkaret lava flows which flowed into Grand Canyon. These rocks were dated using a battery of radio dating tests. 6 different potassium-argon tests were run, getting ages of between 10,000 years old to 117 million years old. 5 rubidium-strontium tests said the rocks were actually 1.27 billion years old to 1.39 billion years old. The lead-lead dating method said the rocks were in fact 2.6 billion years old. Rubidium-strontium isochron method said that no, the rocks were actually 1.34 billion years old. Rubidium-strontium isochron is supposed to be the holy grail of radio dating methods, not only to ascertain the age of a rock, but actually able to give us an indication of how accurate the age is, or if the rock has been contaminated. So which age is the correct age? We have a spread of ages different by a factor of 260,000. Well, rubidium-strontium isochron is supposed to be the most accurate of the methods, so let's go with that age. Oh, did I mention that there's Indian artifacts in the lava flows, therefore we know the lava is actually 800 to 1,000 years old? Oops. This is certainly not an isolated case. A typical old Earth geologist will reply with contamination. Well, obviously we have the wrong answer, therefore the sample must have been contaminated. Wait a minute, that's shooting yourself in the foot. The only reason you are claiming contamination is because we found out the actual age of the rock based on archaeology after the fact. How about all those rock layers that we can't verify the age of, that you've assigned an age of millions, perhaps billions of years to? How can we trust those ages? Bottom line is, we can't. In fact, multiple modern lava flows have been dated using radio dating methods, and invariably they came back with ages of millions to billions of years. Obviously something is horribly, horribly wrong. And by claiming contamination after the fact, you just demonstrated how quickly and easily you are willing to reject your own dates based on the scientific methods of radio dating, which give rock-solid ages. Wait a minute. Are the dating methods reliable or not? Talk about shooting yourself in the foot. In fact, geologists really do pick and choose whatever dates they want. Don't believe me? Just examine for yourself the radio dating history of the famous skull 1470. I covered this in part 21 of Complete Creation. Or check out the notorious dating of the famous Mars rock ALH 84001. When geologist Dr. Steve Austin from the Institute for Creation Research took samples of the lava dome that formed in Mount St. Helens in 1986, he had them radio dated using the potassium-argon dating method. He got ages of 340,000 to 2.8 million years old on rocks that were 10 years old. Well, Henke and the folks at the No Answers in Genesis website just couldn't contain themselves, and they wrote, oh, I love this. Considering that the half-life of potassium-40 is fairly long, 1,250 million years, the potassium-argon method cannot be used to date samples that are much younger than 6,000 years old. A few thousand years are not enough time for argon-40 to accumulate in a sample at high enough concentrations to be detected and quantified. Did these guys stop to think before they wrote? Did they not realize that they just admitted, in print, that if the Earth is only 6,000 years old, that their radio dating methods will give a wrong, incorrect age of millions, perhaps billions of years? Did they not realize that they just handed over the entire debate on a silver platter to a guy wearing a pot on his head? Oh, they really shot themselves in the foot this time. Plus, their claim gets more and more preposterous when you examine it. They said there was not enough time for argon to collect. Well, actually, that wasn't the problem. That's like saying this glass of water actually only has 1 drop of water in it. But the amount is so small that our scientific equipment, which is insanely expensive, can't read that small an amount. That's why it shows the glass falsely as being full when in fact it only has 1 drop. What school did these guys go to? If your scientific equipment can't read that small an amount, it's going to read an amount of 0, not a full glass. If the potassium-argon method really worked, then it should show an age of 0 for the Mount St. Helens rocks, not many, many, many millions of years old. You've got it backwards, guys. Lastly, Henke just admitted in print one of the subtle assumptions you never hear about in radiometric dating, the assumption that the rock is millions of years old. Another subject you never hear brought up with radio dating is calibration. When a scientific method is developed, it is calibrated using known benchmarks. Well, when radio dating was invented, it was calibrated using the ages assigned to the rocks by evolutionary theory. Ages that were arbitrarily assigned. For example, in 1905, we knew that the dinosaurs were 8 million years old. In 1927, we knew that the dinosaurs were 30 million years old. In 1941, we knew that the dinosaurs were 150 million years old. Just as the ages of the dinosaurs and the rock layers that are in have changed over the years, so have the ages of the radio dating methods used to date those rocks. It's changed right along with our knowledge and what we know about the age of the rocks. If the radio date does not line up with the evolutionary assumptions, the radio date is assumed to be incorrect and it is thrown in the garbage. Radio dates are cherry-picked. It's just part of the system. In fact, in what has to be the ultimate irony, we can calibrate the radio dating methods. The Uinkaret lava flows, the Mount St. Helens lavas, the Hawaiian lava flows, all of these lava flows can be used to calibrate radio dating methods. Yet, instead of accepting the obvious conclusion that a radio date of 1.3 billion years old really means the rock is only 1,000 years old, the radio dates are rejected out of hand with lame excuses. Why? Because we need millions and millions and millions of years for evolutionary theory to work. In fact, in my debate with Dr. David Kowarner from Northern Arizona State University, I had challenged him and offered to drive all the way down to Arizona so that he and I could take a sample of the Uinkaret lava flows and put it through any radio dating test he wanted in order to calibrate and test the system. He declined. Could it be because he already knows that any radio dating method he uses is already going to produce an age which is incorrect by millions or billions of years? Look, you can call radio dating methods anything you want, as long as you don't use words, like reliable, trustworthy, scientific, or correct.
There are many lines of evidence that limit the age of the Earth. For example, we know that comets cannot last very long. A comet is made up of ice and dirt, and they orbit the sun in an elliptical path. Now, when comets get close to the sun, that icy material gets blasted out into space, meaning comets are getting smaller and smaller. They are losing mass, and we can calculate the rate as to which these comets are being depleted. The data strongly indicates that comets cannot last millions of years. We also know the rate at which magnetic fields decay. And it turns out our magnetic field is decaying. We can measure the decay of Earth's magnetic field. If you were to run Earth's magnetic field back even 60,000 years, it would have been stronger than a neutron star, which is more than enough to rip the atoms of your body apart.
One of the single strongest arguments for a young Earth is the decay of the Earth's magnetic field. As you see here, the Earth has a magnetic field, which is critically important to our lives. And we have been able to measure the decay, the weakening, the shrinking of the Earth's magnetic field for 200 years. Based on solid scientific data, we know that the Earth's magnetic field shrinks, weakens, decays by 50% every 1,400 years. And that means that if we go forward in time, only a mere 2,000 years, no life would exist on Earth. simply because when the Earth's magnetic field goes to zero, the deadly radiation coming from the sun would irradiate all life on Earth. God created the magnetic field to protect us from this deadly radiation, among other things. But if we go back in time, we have a similar problem. If we go back in time only a mere 10,000 years, the Earth's magnetic field would be 200 times stronger than today. It would kill all life on Earth. So we are living in a very narrow band of time. God never intended the Earth to last for a long time once it became imperfect. And so the Earth cannot even be 10,000 years old, but that is perfectly consistent with the creation 6,000 years ago. And so the decay of the Earth's magnetic field is one of the single strongest arguments for young Earth, over 300 scientific arguments. It limits the age of the Earth to less than 10,000 years old, totally consistent with what the Bible teaches us. That evolutionists cannot be telling us the truth when they say it is millions and millions years old. It is simply impossible.
The magnetic field, the decay of the magnetic field, I completely agree with you. That is a fantastic line of evidence supporting a young Earth. I've heard some evolutionists and uniformitarians try and rescue the old Earth by saying, well, maybe the Earth's magnetic field have gone through reversals, and maybe it's not, exponential decay, these types of rescue devices. What are your thoughts about those, Dr. Grady?
They're living in a fool's paradise. Let's think about this for just a second. First, I'll start off with a great truth, and then we'll attack the question directly, okay? First of all, I don't care what you find in science that disproves evolution, particularly things that are linear, say. They will say, oh no, it's curvilinear. And then when you find something that refutes evolution that's curvilinear, they'll say, oh no, it's straight line. That is a great truth. It comes from Dr. Grady's 101 Great Scientific Truths. Now, when we apply that to the decay of the magnetic field, even evolutionists will agree, because they have to, it's fact. We can measure the decay of the Earth's magnetic field as it is occurring today. Everybody agrees it's going down in strength. Everybody agrees it was stronger in the past. It'll be weaker in the future. That's fact, and they deal with it. However, they realize that if it decays to zero, it proves them wrong. So what do? They invent a fairy tale for adults, and they say, well, yes, it goes to zero, but it's curvilinear. And so what happens is when it does go to zero, then the poles reverse, north-south reverse, the field is regenerated and then starts to decay again. Now, that's a fairy tale, because let's look at the science of that. Now, everybody in the audience is pretty much aware of MRIs or MRTs, depending upon what country you're in. And magnetic resonance imaging works on people. We stick you inside a big electromagnet. We can visualize what you look like on the inside with the use of a computer and software program. And it's really great stuff. I mean, I've had about 6 or 7 myself. It's a whole lot better than cutting you open. But think about it. It works on the basis of magnetism. Now, if you take the current decay of the Earth's magnetic field, remember it decays the same way a radioactive material decays. It's not straight line. So it decays with a half-life. Now, we know the half-life because we've measured it long enough. Remember that we've measured the Earth's magnetic field now for almost 200 years. And we know it has a half-life of 1,400 years. So if you go back in time, every 1,400 years, it's going to double. In the future, it's going to half. Now, if you go back 8 to 10,000 years, the strength of the Earth's magnetic field would be lethal. It would simply kill you. Every single cell in your body would be ripped to shreds. So that means, number one, humans cannot have been on the Earth even 8 to 10,000 years, so we didn't evolve from apes a million years ago. And let's think about this thing about reversal. Now, if the magnetic field goes to zero, we're all going to die because the magnetic field of the Earth causes what's called the Van Allen radiation belts, but it is protecting us from the deadly radiation, primarily solar winds and some galactic radiation as well. But if we don't have it, we'll all be irradiated and die. So if you go forward a while, we're going to die. You go back more than 8 to 10,000 years, we'd be dead. We live in a very short window of time. Next question, second law of thermodynamics. If it went to zero, please tell me by what natural mechanism the field could be regenerated. That's where it's a fairy tale. There's nothing in nature that would rebuild the field. You know, it's asking again to get something from nothing. And so when we take a look at the particulars, the story might sound convincing to those that are not educated or not aware of the science. But to somebody who does know the science, it's an absolutely vacuous argument.
Well, that's a great detailed answer, Dr. Grady, and I love the way you explained it there. And from my understanding, and as you pointed out there, is if we were to run Earth's magnetic field back even just 60,000 years ago, it would have then been stronger than a neutron star, which is more than enough to literally rip the atoms of our body apart. So
well, if you go back 10,000 years, theoretically, you would have what we would call a magnetic star. But of course, life doesn't exist on stars. You don't have to go back 60,000, 10,000, you're dead. And so, again, these ages they talk about cannot possibly happen. And let's take it a little further then. Okay, so if you go back even 8 to 10,000 years, we'll all be dead. And again, if you go forward, say another 14 to 2,800 years, we're all going to be dead. But let's just buy for a second that somehow or another we could survive. And that some mythological way in which we can regenerate the field. Think about the consequences of that. Because what that would mean is that life would have to evolve, all of that life that they talk about evolving in only the last few thousand years, and it would be dead 10,000 years from now. So that means every time the Earth's magnetic field cycled, then we'd have to start all over again. And even they don't believe that.
The magnetic field shields the Earth from cosmic radiations. We know from real-time measurements that I referred to yesterday that the Earth's magnetic field was stronger in the past. A stronger magnetic field meant less carbon-14 production as a result of shielding the Earth from cosmic rays. So if you don't take into effect the Earth's magnetic field being stronger in the past, twice as strong 1,400 years ago, means the radiocarbon production rate was smaller in the past. And so if you don't take that into effect, you're assuming the carbon-14 rate has always been the same. You've already got a problem if you're not taking into account the effect of the strengthening the Earth's magnetic field.
I could go on, but this video will focus on a really good friend of young Earth creationists. Critics of young Earth creation assert that carbon dating destroys a young Earth. This is rather humorous, considering it is indeed carbon dating that overwhelmingly points us to a young Earth. Radiocarbon is produced in the atmosphere through cosmic ray bombardment, which turns nitrogen atoms into carbon-14 atoms. This circulates into the carbon dioxide that we breathe. It is also taken in by plants during photosynthesis. Carbon-14 gets into our bodies because it gets into animals, it gets into plants, vegetables, and we eat these things. Therefore, if we live, we are taking more radiocarbon into our bodies. What does that indicate for when we die? Well, if we are dead, and since we are not taking in any more radiocarbon, the radiocarbon gets less and less, to the point where there should not be any left. After roughly 90,000 or 100,000 years, there should be absolutely no carbon left. And therefore, if we look to dinosaur bones, or fossilized wood, or diamonds, or any sample assumed to be millions to billions of years old, there should be no radiocarbon detected.
Fortunately, there is a way to put carbon-14 dating to the validation test where we can see how accurately it can date items of known ages. This is exactly what the British Science and Engineering Research Council did when they conducted an international blind study on carbon-14 dating by sending out artifacts of known ages to 38 of the world's leading carbon-14 testing laboratories. The results? Only 7 of the 38 laboratories produced dates that were even close to the known dates of the artifacts. That's only 18% of the laboratories in this international study. The rest, 82% of the laboratories, produced dates that were across the board, being off by even thousands of years.
I took 10 samples with a wide geological range of ages, and so here we can see the samples that were chosen, the different coal seams, the states, the supposed geological ages. So they range from around 34 to nearly 320 million years from coals, different coals around the US. And what happened, they were radiocarbon dated, and they grouped here. The mean age was about 48,500 years. But they all grouped in this 47 to 50,000 years in the amount of radiocarbon. And that was interesting because you think about it. These coal seams that were supposed to be between 34 and 320 million years conventional age all gave a similar radiocarbon age, which would imply that all the trees lived at the same time and died at the same time. Well, from a biblical perspective, they were all pre-flood trees that died during the flood.
In 2003, a group of researchers performed an unusual test on 10 coal samples obtained from Pennsylvania State University. The researchers wanted to see if carbon-14 could be detected in the coal samples. This test might be considered unusual because carbon-14 decays relatively fast and should not be detectable after a maximum of 90,000 years. Yet the coal samples tested came from strata allegedly ranging in the age from 37 million to 318 million years. The laboratory tests were clear. All of the 10 coal samples contained carbon-14 and similar amounts. This seriously undermines the evolutionary dates for the rock strata containing the coal, because the presence of carbon-14 affirms that the coal samples cannot be millions of years old. The results fit nicely with the coal forming from vegetation that was buried in Noah's flood.
Dr. Andrew Snelling collected samples of fossilized wood found in different layers of the geologic record and found detectable levels of radiocarbon in each sample. It turns out we find detectable levels of carbon in coal, oil, fossilized wood, and even diamonds. You can find examples of this in the secular literature. This data strongly contradicts the old Earth model. You rarely find the secularists talking about this.
In the RATE project, well, actually it was done earlier. It was done by an Adventist medical doctor, Paul Guyon. He'd looked in the literature from radiocarbon, the journal Radiocarbon, and there's another journal which radiocarbon results are, and a lot of these labs published the results of these experiments where they took coal and oil and limestone and fossils and put them in their instruments to see if there was contamination, and they actually published the results of the radiocarbon, detectable radiocarbon. And we can see that for samples up to supposedly 540 million years old, which is the main fossil record of the flood, we always got measurable radiocarbon. And it was quite significant detectable radiocarbon. So our own research has also confirmed this. For example, research that I started in the 90s, fossilized wood samples from various locations, supposed geological ages up to 250 million years, were all found to have measurable radiocarbon, and therefore radiocarbon ages of only thousands of years, not millions.
Dr. John Baumgardner of the RATE team tested diamonds. Diamonds are perfect to test because they come from deep within the earth. We know that diamonds are made deep down inside the earth, which indicates that these diamonds have not had any contact with the atmosphere. Logically, they should not have any radiocarbon present. These diamonds were tested, and every single one of these diamonds yielded radiocarbon. Dr. Andrew Snelling has pointed out that this data was presented at a conference, American Geophysical Union. This is one of the largest bodies in terms of geologists getting together. A secularist got his own diamonds. tested them himself, and ended up getting the same results as the rate team. This is repeatable data. This data flies in the face of the secular-based assumptions. Every single rescue device put forth by the critics and skeptics have failed miserably. For one, machine error does not work. Even if you have no sample in the machine, there will be no radiocarbon. And so when you put the diamond or the sample in the machine, you get detectable levels of radiocarbon. Therefore, this is not machine error. There can be no contamination. The secularists have no answers. We find samples all throughout the so-called fossil record that have detectable levels of radiocarbon. In regards to diamonds, over 10 times the detection limit. Remember, carbon decays so quickly that, let's say, if every single atom in the universe was made of carbon, it would all decay within 1 million years easily. What about contamination? It's flabbergasting that anybody would actually still use this rescue device. The laboratory applies very strict pre-treatment protocols that involve harsh washings, repeated harsh washings in strong acids. These acids will dissolve anything, and these samples are hit with multiple treatments that ensure only carbon intrinsic to the sample ends up in the instrument to be measured. These samples cannot be contaminated, and this is a weak rescue device.
As soon as people started lampooning the results of the research that I was doing on ancient fossil wood samples, I only had to point them to the treatments that the laboratories had given, that it couldn't be possibly contamination, it was radiocarbon intrinsic to the samples. To test their instruments, they analysed samples that were supposedly radiocarbon dead, that shouldn't have any They chose samples of coals and fossils, but every sample contained detectable carbon-14. Even empty sample holders yielded a 0 result. So they should have concluded that the carbon-14 in the coal and fossil samples were intrinsic. In other words, the samples weren't millions of years old.
The carbon must be intrinsic to the samples. Samples of coal, fossils, including fossilized wood, and even diamonds, all have shown to have detectable levels of radiocarbon in them. This refutes the millions of years paradigm. Lastly, the claim that there is other nuclear material down where the diamonds are that can supposedly recharge the C14 does not work. The rate team investigated this so-called explanation, and they estimated that you would need 13,000 times more nuclear material in the nearby rocks in order to adequately recharge the C14. You would need far too much material to recharge, unrealistic amounts, deep down in the earth. Cosmic rays cannot reach deep in the earth, and therefore C14 should just decay away.
You mentioned carbon and how carbon is found in diamonds, coal, fossilized wood, I believe as well. Have you personally, have you been convinced, or have you seen any good rebuttals to why that is?
The best I've seen, and it won't work, the best I've seen is that there's other nuclear material down there that can recharge the C14. But the rate group looked into that, and they estimated that you'd need 13,000 times more radioactive material in these rocks than is actually found there in order to adequately recharge the C14. And when I recently debated Hugh Ross, that he thought that was the answer, and I pointed out to him, no, you'd need far more nuclear material. See, the idea is, so C14 decays quickly. C14, we find it in diamonds, we find it in coal, and these are buried deep down in the earth, because normally the way C14 is made is in the upper atmosphere. When cosmic rays strike, they cause a cascade that transforms nitrogen into C14. And But deep down in the Earth, the cosmic rays can't penetrate that far. They can't go very far into the Earth. They have they're very high energy. They can't go deep into the Earth. And so the idea is that C14 that's in anything that's deep down should simply decay away. And the half-life of C14 is 5,730 years. So it doesn't take millions of years for this stuff to decay away. And the idea is that the secularists have proposed that perhaps radioactive material could create the free thermal neutrons that could then create new C14 in these substances, recharge them. That C14 that's turned into nitrogen, turned back into C14. But the problem is the rate of radioactive decay of these other substances is much slower than the rate at which C14 decays. And so a typical element might be, say, 100,000 times slower than C14. So you get C14, boom, boom, it's emitting 100,000 conversions in the time it takes this element up here to turn once. And potentially one of those could recharge one of the nitrogen atoms back into C14. But that's not going to work because these things are popping off like this, and then every now and then one of them gets recharged. That's not going to help. That's not going to keep it supplied with such a vast quantity of C14 that we do find in these things. And so you'd expect in order to have some kind of equilibrium where the C14 is continually recharged, the amount of other nuclear material would have to be greater in proportion to carbon, roughly relative to their the ratio of their half-lives, which is enormous, factor of 1 million or so, depending on the element. So it's not going to work. There's no way you can recharge that deep down. I think the reason some people assume that that's happened is because I think they found evidence that places that have extra nitrogen, you also find more C14 there. But that's a prediction of the rate research group, because if you have accelerated decay, that will happen, because with accelerated decay, that uranium can decay into lead much, much more quickly. And we think that the longer half-lives were shortened by a much greater ratio than half-lives that are already short. Like carbon-14 probably wouldn't have been affected very much by accelerated decay. And so that is going to do it, but it's only going to do it during the flood year until the accelerated decay shuts off, and then it's not going to happen anymore. So other than that, I haven't seen any good answer to the evidence for the fact that we find C14 in just about everything that has carbon in it, in contrast to what you'd expect if the Earth were billions of years old.
Deep time proponents have failed to account for why radiocarbon is found in samples claimed to be millions and even billions of years old. Given the fact that radiocarbon lasts less than 1 million years, the evidence points to young Earth creation and refutes the deep time paradigm.
All the strange words make sense.
These coal samples carbon date to be between 40 and 60,000 years, but they are sandwiched between geological layers that are supposedly 34 to 318 million years old. So, which age are we supposed to believe?
Yeah, based on everything that you're saying, I've found that the critics or the skeptics, they kind of lack a counter rebuttal when it comes to the evidence, and obviously, as you're pointing out, ad hominems and personal attacks don't count. So, what we see today in terms of uniformitarian processes, they can't actually explain the geological features of the Earth. So one argument that I've heard them point to over and over again is because they don't have any counter rebuttal to all the evidence suggesting a global worldwide flood, right? They'll say that these catastrophic processes during the flood, the fountains of the Great Deep breaking open, catastrophic plate tectonics, for example, they'll assert that a tremendous amount of heat is being produced from these processes, that it would preclude a global flood because this heat would boil the oceans, essentially, melt the crust, and kill Noah and the arks due to the radiation. I know there's a lot of creation scientists working on this, so it's probably a question that could take a couple-hour lecture.
Yeah.
of itself. But I'm curious, what are your specific thoughts on that objection that they point?
Okay, you are right. There's no one quick answer that I can just spill out and it's definitive and positive. But then that's fine. That's not a problem. There's so many problems from a secular point of view with deposition and so on and so forth. Anyway, as in you wouldn't physically get what we see around us if it was so. That there's going to be objections and issues on the creationist side as well. And the flood heat problem, as it's known, is a real problem. It's a genuine problem, and like you say, there are many creationists working on it. So I'm pretty sure we've got an article, a very in-depth article about it on the Ask site. So go there and have a look. Plus, you can find stuff on Answers in Genesis and so on and so forth. My brief comments, and they will be brief because, like you say, it could be a 2-hour lecture.
Right.
We have been doing some good research into the production of oil and coal. Particularly the process behind the production of oil and coal, and we have been producing oil and gas, natural oil and gas, in a matter of weeks, and natural coal in a matter of days. Right, using specific plants and so on and so forth, putting them in natural environments, controlled environments, but natural environments, and watching them go to work. And what's interesting is a lot of the fast production, because again, the standard production of oil and coal is a swamp-like environment where you have trees and whatever settle into the ground where they've been living and dying and slowly building up peat, which over time very slowly gets compressed. Now, there's a whole series of issues with that, and we could get into all of them, including the fact that the majority of plants found in coal measures do not come from swamp-like environments. But like I say, don't have time to get into that. But if you want to produce coal quickly, if you want to produce oil quickly, there definitely seems to be a specific process which is connected with it. And the process requires heat. So we've done different tests in different backgrounds, in different temperatures, and things with more heat produce coal, oil, and natural gas way quicker, sometimes in the order of hours, if you add a certain amount of heat to them. Now, all around the Earth, if you interpret the geological record, or the vast majority of the geological record, particularly the vast majority of coal, oil, and natural gas deposits to a global flood, as I do, as many other creation scientists do, and there's a lot of evidence for that we've discussed in this program and the last program, and John has discussed, and you can go back through our website and SOT and so on and so forth and find out the evidence for it. There are a huge amount of coal and oil deposits. Now, I did a calculation somewhere, and I can't remember the exact details. I'll put them up. I can put it up on the comments later, which was calculating based on modern day production of plants and so on and so forth, basing that in a flood, and then making the point that before the flood there would have been plenty enough of organic material in plants and animals to produce this amount of coal and oil and so on and so forth. And that's a fascinating study in itself, but I don't want to misquote my research, so I'll put it up separately. But the point was there's plenty of material to produce coal and oil. However, you still need a mechanism to produce it in the space of a flood. Well, if our research is correct, and I say we're still in the early stages of it at the moment, but if our research is correct, then there is a definitive connection between heat and coal and oil production. Now, in a global flood scenario, lots of tectonic activity, lots of things, lots and lots of heat, hence the flood heat problem. However, what you do have is the perfect environment to actually absorb an incredible amount of that heat in the form of a chemical and physical process which is connected to producing coal and oil. So I'm not saying that is the answer. I'm saying that we think that could be an answer, and we will certainly continue investigating it because of the connections with coal and oil and rapid formation and so on and so forth, and that's a fascinating study as it is. But if we are proven to be right, or certainly find evidence for that, you may well have a good piece of evidence explaining the flood heat problem, as in you've created an enormous battery, if you like, which sucks up the vast majority of the heat, or certainly enough heat to avoid the heat problem, in the form of coal and oil production. And that would also explain how we could get the huge amounts of coal and oil produced in the space of a 1 year or soon after that 1 year flood. So there's a few thoughts. Like I say, the critics will probably tear it to shreds, and that's fine. We're in the early stages of this, but there are certainly enough issues with the secular interpretation of the geological history on the Earth that we've valid a few objections ourselves, or issues ourselves. But I think the more we do research into this, the more we will actually see there's a perfect explanation for it. And me personally, I highly suspect it has something to do with the formation of coal, oil, and basically the carbonization process, or the change into carbonites. So they're my thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great. Actually, George, I got a couple thoughts on my mind if I can get them out real quick.
Okay.
Before I lose them, but that's a great answer, phenomenal answer, and exactly, no model's perfect. And as you're pointing out, heat and energy would then be features of the flood, and not necessarily, obviously, not necessarily a bug like the critics want to say. I've also heard that particular lines of evidence, and I know George can speak to this as well, that seem to indicate accelerated nuclear decay has occurred in the past, like radio halos and fission tracks come to mind. I've heard that they
whole different topic,
And I've heard that those lines of evidence, those scars in the rocks themselves, would not actually exist if there was as much heat as the critics suggest, because the excess heat would have obliterated those lines of evidence. So I've heard that too, which means, rapid cooling or these types of mechanisms that you're talking about that could mitigate the heat are plausible. So, and I apologize, George.
I just said briefly, you go ahead, George.
I was just going to bring in two other points with regards to the heat. I mean, science has shown that there's a substance called ringwoodite, and apparently from I guess they've calculated it in some way. They've determined that 1.5 to 2.5% of the ringwoodite would contain water, and they estimate something like 3 times as much water is contained in ringwoodite as exists in the oceans today. So that's another area where you could get heat absorption because of the specific heat absorption of water. But also we did a stream some time ago, Joe, with Steph Farina. He's done quite a bit of work on salt domes and the magmatic nature of salt domes. Effectively, it's molten salt. And when you look at it and you look at the geometry of the shape of the salt domes, you have to ask yourself, how could that molten salt go through those those hard rock layers and form in that shape? There's only one way that could happen. Those layers had to be moist. Otherwise, you would never get that shape forming.
Yeah, and I think honestly, I mean, I say there's not a one quick answer to the flood heat problem, and I don't think there ever will be. I think it will be a mixture of different things, like you mentioned, the radio halos and so on and so forth, and the salts, and on our part with the coal and stuff. I think it's going to be a mixture of different things, and that's because we have different scientists working on them. I mean, my background, like I say, is paleontology or paleobiology, specifically earth science, looking into sedimentation and recreating paleo environments and animals and so on and so forth like that, right? That's not only my academic background, it's also my main interest, right? So I'm going to be looking more into that. So when I'm doing investigations and when we're doing coal and oil and so on and so forth, that's where we're mostly looking at. Whereas the people who spearhead radio halos like Snelling or so on and so forth, they are not as much sedimentary geologists as they are geophysicists. I mean, Andrew Snelling's PhD was in geophysics, right? And in radiocarbon stuff and radioactive stuff and radio halo. So he's going to be looking a lot more into that, and Larry Vardman and the whole sort of rate people as well, And so different geologists are going to be coming at it from different points of view based on their own knowledge and based on their own interests as well. So I think that ultimately, I mean, science is not whether you are a secular scientist or whether you're a creation scientist is not a one answer job. There's often many different facets that actually get brought into an answer or something, because you are reconstructing a history of the past, and there are going to be mistakes when you do that. There are going to be issues when you do that. The question is, what do you take as your authority? Do you take a pagan idea at its roots, which has become philosophized into a point which has been primarily to reject scripture and be anti-religion as your starting point, which has birthed the foundations of what is considered now geology and dating methods and so on and so forth? Or do you take the Bible? I mean, both of them come from religious standpoints, there's no doubt about that. But to claim that it's purely objective is simply false. So there's going to be lots of issues, there's going to be lots of contradictions and stuff as you go through, and issues and debates, and that's great. Let's go for it. But as I say, it's not going to be, I don't think it's ever going to be a one quick answer, here's the answer to that kind of thing. But I think there's going to be a multifaceted answer to it, and I'm pretty convinced that there's going to be something to do with so if it's not coal or oil, although I'm pretty sure that it will be, there'll be something which can absorb large amounts of heat very, very, very quickly. And that energy is transferred. The heat energy is being transferred into a chemical and physical process, which basically is carbonization. It turns one form of carbon into another form of carbon. That's it at a very, very simple level.
For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button, because we are just getting started.
They feel that this one actually defeats biblical creation, as we know it won't, but multiple meteorites, moon rocks, and Martian rocks dated on location all yield a consistent age of 4.6 billion years, plus or minus a few. This is true across a variety of locations, across a variety of different dating methods.
We don't.
How would you explain this?
We don't have any access for sure to anything from Mars by which we could date it. It's thought that some of the rocks that we collect on Earth that are meteorites may have originally been from Mars. I'm a little skeptical of that. We certainly don't know that's the case. We do have rocks from the moon, and those have been dated using the uranium lead, I believe, method, and perhaps others. And yeah, you do get ages of 4.5 billion years, which you don't get for Earth rocks. Interestingly, you don't get quite as old ages for Earth rocks. So, but the secular thinking is that Earth's been reworked by plate tectonics, and so you don't have original Earth rocks. They've all been reworked multiple times. What's the explanation for that? Well, we think that there's very compelling evidence that the rate at which radioactive decay has happened in the past has been accelerated, and that would account for why there tends to be a convergence on a particular age for rocks that are not Earth rocks. For Earth rocks, you get inconsistent ages. You can take an Earth rock and date it using one method and then date it using another method, and you get different answers. And this has been well documented. John Woodmarappy's book, The Mythology of Modern Dating Methods, documents published dates. These are ones that have been peer-reviewed. They're published in the peer-reviewed literature, to say nothing of the dates that were inconsistent and therefore never published. I mean, think about that. Think you're a secularist and you date a rock and it gets you an age that's way off what is expected to be for that formation. Probably you don't publish it. You say, well, obviously something went wrong there. And so the fact that you have inconsistent data, even within the literature that was published, suggests that there's a far greater number of inconsistencies that have not been published. The Rate Research Project, too, in their book, they also documented. There's a chapter on the discordant date. So it's not as consistent as you've been led to believe. Now, I do think it's a little more consistent for moon rocks because they haven't been reworked. There was no worldwide flood on the moon. And so whatever process God used to make the moon apparently was pretty uniform. And so even though the decay rates have been accelerated, there's good evidence for that. Read the rate research on that. Presumably it happened at a uniform rate. And so that's why you get some degree of consistency with moon rocks, but very little consistency with Earth rocks.
Yeah, there probably is some kind of maybe enhancement of the decay rates. For example, here's something. When they went to the moon and they got one of the first moon rocks and they brought it back, I forget the exact number of what they identified it as. Oh, here it is. Lunar sample 14321. It dated at 4 billion years old. But when they tested it, it was actually a piece of driftwood from Earth. But the oldest tree dated is 350 million years ago on Earth. So how could that even be a thing? I'm just curious if you ever heard about that or considered.
I haven't heard about that specific one. I have heard of examples of, for example, wood that's embedded inside rock. Volcano will come, uproot trees, lava will flow over it. So you have wood embedded in rock, and the rock dates to millions of years, and the wood dates to thousands of years. So that's a problem. And in case people are wondering, when you date a rock, it's supposed to tell you when the rock hardened, because before that everything's liquid. The minerals can move in and out, but when it solidifies, then that's supposed to trap the parent and daughter elements. And so the only way you get daughter elements is by the conversion of parent elements, and yet you get wild inconsistencies. So inconsistencies in radiometric dating is not new. It's well known, and we've taken rocks from Mount St. Helens, brand new rocks, sent them into secular labs to have them dated. You get hundreds of thousands of years on brand new rocks. So we know radiometric dating does not work on rocks of known age. It's assumed to work on rocks of unknown age. And I think that's not very scientific.
Yeah, matter of fact, you mentioned accelerated nuclear decay. So if this was occurring maybe during the flood or even during the creation event, would this have also made these dates unreliable?
Yeah, if you assume that the decay rate is constant, when in fact it was faster in the past, your ages will be inflated. And they'll be inflated by the degree to which you assumed that something was constant divided by the rate at which it was accelerated as a rough measurement. So if the decay rates were millions of times faster during the flood year, for example, and there's very compelling evidence for this, because the fact is when uranium, for example, when a uranium atom it decays into the next element, which decays into the next one, all the way down to lead-206. For every one uranium that turns into a lead-206, it emits, in that process of radioactive decay, it emits 8 helium nuclei. So it produces helium as a byproduct. And helium is a gas, and rocks are porous. And so gas can leak through rocks. And it doesn't take millions of years for that to happen. And so the bottom line is, if the rate at which the uranium turned into lead had always been the slow rate that it is today, that the helium that's produced would have had plenty of time to escape. There should be very little helium in these rocks. And the research team found that there's abundant helium trapped inside these rocks that have radioactive elements in them. And it's consistent with all of that decay having happened in the recent past, thousands of years ago. Now, there is a temperature dependence in terms of the rate at which the helium leaks through. But in order for it to accommodate the data in billions of years, the temperature would have been close to absolute zero, which is absurd because the temperature actually gets hotter as you go in toward the Earth, because the Earth has a molten core. So there's compelling evidence that the radioactive decay rates were much faster in the past. There's been this opinion in the last few decades, well, previous to the rate research and a few other research projects by secularists, actually, there was this opinion that radioactive decay rates cannot be influenced by any external parameters, because when you do chemical experiments, it tends not to affect the radioactive decay rate. But we now know that it's false. There are some ways of accelerating certain kinds of radioactive decay. For example, the rhenium-osmium reaction has been sped up in a laboratory by a factor of 1 billion. And all you have to do is strip away the electrons from the rhenium, and it will decay much, much more quickly. So, and that's one method. That's a method we can do. God obviously has options that we don't have. God could change the nuclear strong force by a bit, and that would change the rates of decay and so on. So there are different ways in which radioactive decay could be accelerated. We think there's good evidence that happened during the flood year, and that would explain why the secularists, not including that factor, get ages that are far older than the true age, including on things whose true age is known, because it happened in recorded history, for example.
Makes sense. Do you think that this accelerated nuclear decay would have caused what they deem as the heat problem? They said, this convection and the subduction plates would have caused so much heat generated during this nuclear process that the oceans would have boiled. Have you heard of this? Do you have an answer?
Yes, I've heard of that. Yes, I haven't seen a detailed study on that, other than there are ways to dump the heat. First of all, you need heat. You need heat to start the flood. So that's not a bug, that's a feature. To get the plates moving, they need energy, and an acceleration of radioactive decay, that's a great way to start plates moving, to heat them up to where they can be hot enough where they could be almost not quite a liquid state, but it makes them more malleable. Where did the heat go? Well, we don't know. First of all, we don't know what the Earth's temperature was in the core, for example, before the flood year. What if a lot of that energy is now, what if it's still there? What if it's still in the core? A lot of the energy could have gone into that. A lot of the energy could have been dumped to space. There have been creationist models of hypercanes, for example, which is like a hurricane, but on a much more massive scale. Hurricanes are very good at dumping heat, dumping energy to space. When a hurricane goes over the ocean's temperature drops by 10 degrees. And that's a piddly hurricane. Imagine a hypercane that's taking all this energy and dumping it into space. Convection is a great way to move heat quickly. It's the best way to do it. And we think there was a lot of convection during that flood year. So there probably were spots on the ocean, hot spots that boiled. There probably were. But as soon as they get to the air and they spray up, and then they lose that heat and so on, they lose it to space. So there are lots of ways of dumping the heat, and perhaps a lot of the heat is still in Earth's interior. Since we don't know what the original Earth's interior, we don't know how hot it was to begin with. Some of the energy could have gone there. There are other explanations for that. I don't have the numbers with me to see, which of these is the most plausible, but But there are some possibilities right there. So certainly it's not a knockdown, drag out argument against a accelerated decay because it produces heat. That's a feature. We need some heat to start the flood, and as long as you can dump it to space fast enough, you're going to be fine.
Right. That was a really good answer. Probably one of the best I've heard on that specific criticism from your critics that say there's an unsolvable heat problem. And I've seen you, Dr. Lyell, speak on accelerated decay quite a bit. I saw you brought up the helium and zircons in a debate you had with Dr. Ross, but this was one I think years ago where Frank Turek was moderating. And I wasn't exactly thrilled with Hugh's response. I think you got him on that one real good. And I guess you did kind of just answer this actually, but the question would be what are some of the best responses to critics who say, because I constantly hear them still continuously repeat this, even though you just gave a huge number of overwhelming lines of evidence suggesting accelerated nuclear decay has occurred, but they still say, nope, this isn't possible. It's never been observed in the lab. What's a good quick response to these critics who make that
Well,
claim?
it has been observed in the lab. There's no doubt about that. Have them look at the rhenium-osmium reaction.
Right.
Bound state beta decay. You can make that rhenium decay 1 billion times faster than it does in normal circumstances in nature. And granted, I'm not suggesting that that's the solution to all of them. I'm not suggesting that that all the material is ionized and things like that. But my point is, if you want to blow away this assumption, the assumption that radioactive decay rates are always constant is false. It's demonstrably false. That has been disproved in a laboratory. Now, that doesn't automatically mean that decay rates were faster in the past, but it does mean that that's a possibility. It's not something that can be dismissed out of hand. I do think the helium and the zircons is just, I don't know how secularists sleep at night with that data, because how do you explain that? In billions of years, there's been plenty of time for that helium to escape. We know the rate at which it leaks through rocks. That's been measured, and there's just no way you can make sense of that. I'm not an evidentialist, but at the same time, I don't see a good rescuing device even for that.
Right.
So I think the evidence is very compelling for accelerated decay, and in any case, we have tested radiometric dating on rocks of known age, and it often gives the wrong answer. So that immediately, as a scientist, just somebody being an objective scientist, you should say, we really shouldn't have a lot of confidence in that method because we know it gives wrong answers on dates of known age. So it doesn't make sense to trust it on dates of estimated ages for things whose origin is not known.
Right. I think you nail it with that, Dr. Lyell, where you say we don't get accurate dates from rocks of known age, but yet they want us to trust the rocks of unknown age and the dates. It just seems common sense not to. Yeah. So
can he briefly explain whether or not that the rate has changed over time pertaining to carbon dating, or is it consistent in the past, would you say?
I'm not an absolute expert on carbon dating, but I've studied it a fair amount, especially relative to creation issues. Carbon dating, like radioisotope dating, requires many assumptions about the past and even about the present in order to get any accurate measurements. Now, it is very useful at times to get approximate ideas of time from carbon dating, but of course it has a short half-life of only about 5,000 years or something. Carbon 14 half-life, which is the radioactive isotope of carbon 12. So the question was, how is it related? Carbon dating, as most people do not understand, can only be used in samples that have organic material in them, number one. You can't date an igneous rock, a quartz rock, a fossil that's completely petrified. It has to be a sample that has organic material in it, number one, and then it cannot be any older, in theory, than about 80 to 100,000 years, depending on the type of equipment that you're using to measure the radioisotope proportions in it. Some equipment is more accurate than others. And on the outside, anything that is over 100,000 years using the best AMS equipment should not show any radiocarbon in it. But indeed, we do find carbon-14 in samples of so-called tens of millions to hundreds of millions of years old, which is totally, anathema to what you would expect from carbon dating. So there's something wrong with these samples when they come up with find these fossils and such that are claimed to be in the geologic record in the tens of millions of years old, when it still contains carbon-14. It's totally incongruent with the data. They cannot be that old.
Standing, Dr. Baumgardner has written a paper, that paper on the carbon-14 and diamonds and coal and whatever. And there's a section in that report where he talks about the rate, whether the rate of carbon-14, the decay has actually changed over time. Now, I can't remember, it's been a while since I've read that section, so I don't want to say anything in case I get it wrong, but if you care to download that particular report, or I can provide it in the comment section if you leave a comment there, you can read it yourself and see what Dr. Baumgardner has to say about that particular question.
Yeah, you're right. It's not just the half-life of carbon-14 in question. It's how fast is it being produced in the atmosphere. And one of the assumptions is that it's been produced at a particular rate in the atmosphere for, thousands and millions of years constantly. But that's a far stretch because different atmospheric effects, including the effects of the atomic bomb blast experimentations that we did in the 1940s and 50s, have affected the atmosphere. And so we know that there are various effects on what the rate of carbon-14 being produced in the atmosphere, and that leads to uncertainties and inaccuracies.
They call that the equilibrium problem. Even Libby, the inventor of the carbon-14 method, actually realized that if the Earth was billions of years old, there was a problem.
Yeah.
And even with the fact that we know the magnetic field is decaying, which essentially limits the age of the Earth as well, with a stronger magnetic field in the past, in the pre-flood world, that would also affect cosmic ray bombardment in the, production of C14 as well. So
absolutely. And we know the magnetic field is decreasing. We've been measuring it for over 100 years. We know we have a pretty good handle mathematically on the decay rate, and that would definitely affect the fact that carbon-14 would not be produced in the upper atmosphere at the same rate for eons of time.
Right. Great point. So as always with the uniformitarian, a lot of assumptions are at play when it comes to
the main thing is that it would be difficult to get an exact date using carbon-14. You could get an estimate, an approximate date, but certainly when you find carbon-14 in samples that are purported to be in the tens of millions of years old, there's definitely that is incongruous with the idea of an old Earth, and especially when you find it in diamonds. That's a whole discussion in itself. We found carbon-14 in diamonds, and the crystallography of diamonds is such that it is the most compact atomic structure that we know of on the Earth. and nothing can penetrate in it, inside of it or outside of it, nothing in the natural. So there's no way to get carbon-14 contamination inside a diamond crystal.
Yeah.
And yet we find carbon-14 in there.
It's funny because they want to resort to that rescue device of contamination. And as you so perfectly pointed out, Sal, you've got C14 in diamonds, which are essentially the hardest substance on Earth. So they should be resistant to contamination. So they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, aren't they?
They're totally resistant to contamination. We don't know how to get anything inside of a diamond, you know, that I know of.
Right.
Because the carbon structure is a tetrahedron, a compact tetrahedral structure, which is known to chemistry and is extremely, dense, and it doesn't fit anything else in there. Minerals that are contaminated because the structure is looser, you might say, and it will accommodate other atoms of other elements inside the structure to some extent, to a limited extent. But you can't squeeze anything else into a diamond.
Yeah, because that rescue device doesn't work too well, Sal. They're now throwing their own scientists under the bus and suggesting that it's laboratory background contamination, but they don't seem to realise that the results, even the rate results that were achieved, had that background contamination subtracted.
They checked all
Subtracted from the results. So even when it was subtracted, they had measurable quantities of carbon-14.
I find it funny. Before I move on to the next question, I guess this question, the topic of dating methods could be an entire show in and of itself. But I find it funny when they want to bring these arguments up, you know, C14 radioisotope dating, when in fact that very line of evidence limits the age of the Earth, as Sal was pointing out. C14 in diamonds, in fossilized wood, you know, all of these things that are dated according to the evolutionists tens of millions of years old. And you can get into helium and zircon crystals, and you know, we could talk all day about those lines of evidence that they think are irrefutable confirmation of an old Earth actually limits the age of the Earth. So
do we have time for me to bring up my slide of the AMS form that you submit for radiocarbon dating?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'll do that. It's very instructive, being that we're on that subject matter. Let's see, I'll share my screen, right?
Yep, yep, there we go. I just added it to the stream, Sal.
This is the picture in this corner here, the image of the sample submission that you would submit. In this case, it's the Arizona State AMS facility. That's the atomic mass spectrometer for radioisotope dating. And in this down here on the actual submission form, I don't know if you could read it. If it's large enough, I'll read it for you. It says expected age, and please provide other information. So right on the form, as you're giving that to them to date a radioisotope sample, they're asking you for the expected age. Now, why would they ask you for the expected age if it's a absolute dating method? They shouldn't need any input from you to date the sample. So this is the way the sample is dated. You see, they assume the age of the sample based on the evolutionary suppositions of presuppositions that you have of the sample, and then they send it to a lab, okay, for isotopic dating, okay, and then they compare the isotope results from the lab with the assumed age up here. They compare the lab results with the assumed age, and then they look to see if they agree. Now, if they agree, they'll publish it. But if they don't agree, they go all around the chain again and start all over again, manipulating the sample or the data or having an excuse as to why they did not agree. This is not real science, because they shouldn't be asking you for the expected age in the first place. They do that in order to compare their results with what you're expecting and deciding whether they're going to publish it or not. Isn't that quite something?
That's amazing. It's
very
amazing.
disingenuous.
Yes, very disingenuous.
What you're not told right here, what you are not told is that any published dates must agree with the initial assumptions of the sample's evolutionary position in the geologic record. If it doesn't agree, they have a fancy name for that. It's called discordant. And it's thrown in the circular file.
Yeah.
Right there is a document we all need to screen share every time an evolutionist brings up that topic, because essentially they're assuming the evolutionary position to prove evolution, to prove deep time. Assume deep time to prove deep time. Circular.
Can I add that form you fill out? It's not just for carbon-14 or the AMS. It's pretty much for any dating method.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a general form for, radioisotope dating. And this is not just a form. I mean, this form is from the university in Tucson. But most all the labs, from what I understand, have a very similar form. They require you to submit the expected age.
Yeah, correct.
That's very good.
So before SFT sort of finalizes the stream, and now that you're an expert at sharing your information, I'd like to take you up on that offer of you coming back to do another presentation on stratification.
Yeah, I do have another presentation on the other end. Like one of the audiences asked, what about the deposition? This presentation was on the erosion, but what about all the units that are claimed to be millions of years from deposition? I will show you that these units are totally incongruous with what we see on the surface of the Earth today. In other words, the current state of situations, the present is not the key to the past.
Right. Yeah, no, it would be an honor to have you on again for that presentation, Sal.
What about the evidence from carbon, Dr. Sarfati, like with diamonds, for example?
Yes. Well, see, this carbon dating is the best known type of radiometric dating. Sorry, pardon me. The radioactive dating methods, you take an unstable parent isotope, which decays over time into daughter isotopes, and supposedly from the amount of chemicals in a sample, you can tell how long that thing has been decaying for. Now, you had to have a certain assumption, like how much did we start with each of these things? Right. I mean, did we actually start with 0 daughter atoms, or were they there in the first place? Has the rate been constant? Well, that's actually a reasonably good assumption, but there are exceptions to that, which I think have been found now. Good evidence for that. But also, is the system a closed system, or has it been contaminated with some of the stuff coming from outside, so you're destroying it? I mean, we always like to think of a bathtub. It's got 20 gallons in it, and the taps are on, and it fills at 2 gallons per minute. So how long did it take for the bath to get to where it is? And you might say, well, obviously it's 10 minutes, divide 20 by 2. But in fact, what if I told you that in fact someone helpfully poured some boiling water in because it got a bit cold? So the source is some stuff from outside, and you didn't know the plug was leaking, so some stuff is leaking out of it too. And also the way I fill a bath, I might actually turn both taps on full, and then I actually slow down the tap rate so it doesn't overflow. You see, so you're assuming that the taps have been the rate that they're flowing now, but in fact they've been changed over time. So you've got these certain assumptions that even apply to something as simple as a bathtub, and yet it applies to the radioactive dating itself. But then let's talk about carbon dating. See, carbon-14 is an unstable isotope of carbon. You know, carbon is, you've got carbon in your body. It's the most important element for life. Okay, so all of us have carbon. 1 in every trillion carbon atoms is carbon-12, which is unstable. And the theory is something dies, it stops exchanging carbon with the environment, so the existing carbon is not replaced and it decays over time, and the half-life is about 5,730 years. And the half-life is the time taken for the stuff to get to half its initial amount. After 2 half-lives, it's going down to a quarter. After 3 half-lives, it's down to 1/8 and 1/16, 1/32, etc. Okay. The point of doing the calculations, I'm enough of the chemist to do those calculations. You could calculate that even if the whole Earth was full of carbon-14, pure carbon-14, it wouldn't even last 1 million years. Okay, you wouldn't find any detectable carbon-14 after 1 million years. So then you go to diamonds, and diamond is a type of carbon. An allotrope, as we say in chemistry. So an allotrope of carbon is the hardest substance on Earth, apart from the human heart anyway. So the point is, once the diamond crystal has been formed, it should be totally free from contamination. It should be about as contamination-free as you can get. So it's a perfect laboratory to test carbon-14 if it's a good dating method, and yet they've tested diamond after diamond and find there's still carbon-14 in those diamonds. And yet the diamonds are meant to be 1 billion years old or more. Impossible. But if they're over 100,000 years or even over 50,000 years, we shouldn't expect to find any carbon-14 in the diamonds at all. So the fact that we're finding carbon-14 in coal and diamonds shows they haven't existed long enough for the carbon-14 to have decayed. So this puts a strict upper limit on the possible age of these things. Not the actual age, but it couldn't be any higher than this. It might be lower, but it can't be higher. So carbon-14 is definitely a friend of the biblical creation model and a terrible enemy for the billions of years dogma.
Right. That's a really good point, Dr. Sarfati. And I find when you show them the evidence for like carbon in fossils, or even in strata that the evolutionists themselves will date to tens of millions of years old, they'll say contamination. But then you bringing up diamonds, well, diamonds being the hardest substance on Earth, wouldn't its interior then be very resistant to contamination? I mean,
well,
can
I
they
think
use
if
that argument?
diamond isn't resistant, nothing is.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that's throw the method away. If it can't work on diamonds, I wouldn't trust it on a bone or a parchment, for instance, if it doesn't work on diamonds. So you see, you can have it both ways. Either you have to say that carbon-14 dating is reliable, or you can have billions of years. You can't have both. You can't do both.
It sounds like they want to have both with a lot of the evidence and arguments. We've got Tony Torpa in the chat who says, what is a good explanation for how radiocarbon C14 originally got inside the diamonds where it was found in rate studies?
I would have to assume it was primordial carbon, because it couldn't have got in from outside. So presumably primordial carbon when the diamond was formed in the mantle. That's the only thing I can think of, that God created a whole range of isotopes.
Right. And
there's a primordial amount in the initial diamonds, because I'm not sure if diamonds are regarded to have formed from organic carbon. So I'd have to say it's primordial carbon that was created there. The fact that however it got there is there.
Right.
The fact that it's there in the first place means it can't be that old.
I think based on everything you're saying, the fact that, I mean, we find carbon in diamonds, fossils, I believe they've even found it in coal and fossilized wood. In places where they say are tens of millions of years old. So
hundreds of millions, billions even, yeah.
Billions of
What about, I guess, because Tony here mentioned the RATE project, didn't they also find helium, which is incredibly slippery? They've discovered helium.
Okay, this is Dr. Russell Humphrey's work. See, Dr. John Baumgardner was the one who did the carbon-14 work for RATE, and he's got some really good material. He answers the objections really well. Dr. Russell Humphreys did another part of the RATE project, which is to look at helium and zircons. And zircon is a very hard mineral that's quite hard to melt. And what he found was helium and zircon. Now, the zircon has radioactive uranium in it, and uranium is turning into lead. And in the process of uranium turning to lead, it loses 8 helium helium atoms from its nucleus. It's called alpha decay. Alpha particles are helium nucleus. So it emits an alpha particle. The alpha particle grabs some electrons and becomes helium. So you've got a lot of the fact that you have helium there shows that quite a lot of decay has happened. But in fact, if it had happened gradually over millions of years, the helium should have leaked out of the zircon, because you can measure how fast helium leaks out. And there's still a lot of helium there. I mean, you think about how long, if you have a helium balloon for your kid's birthday party, you know very well that it's going to shrink in a few days, because the helium is so slippery, it goes through the rubber of the balloon. You've had that frustration, I bet.
Right.
So even zircon is not hard enough to stop the helium from leaking out of it, and that can be measured. And so what Dr. Humphrey says, that this shows that we've had millions of years of decay, but it must have happened in an accelerated manner. So it's producing this decay really quickly, such that the helium hasn't had a chance to escape. So all the decays happened very recently, and so the helium from that decay is still not yet leaked out. And he also did a control experiment with argon, which is it's the same sort of gas, the same sort of inert gas as helium, but much heavier, so it diffuses more slowly. But he did a control on argon diffusion. Again, it backed up what he found with the helium. So helium is showing that the decay must have happened only about 6,000 years ago. Otherwise, the helium would have gone, which again points to the fact that the decay rate has not been constant, and that undermines another major assumption behind radioactive dating is the constancy of decay rate, and clearly Dr. Humphreys has shown that it's not constant.
So I'm glad you pointed that out. So that's evidence directly in the rocks then, Dr. Sarfati, that rapid nuclear decay has occurred,
right?
Which gets rid of that assumption, the constant decay.
And the thing is, it's quite common in science to discover that something has occurred without being able to explain the mechanisms of how that has occurred. I mean, Newton discovered that the law of gravity exists. He didn't offer any explanation as to why gravity works in the first place. He said, I form no hypothesis. He wasn't going to speculate on what causes gravity, only that gravity exists. And for instance, I'm not sure how nuclear decay rate gets accelerated, only the fact that it has clearly been accelerated.
Right. That's a really good point you make, because I've even read in the research, not only helium, but I believe it was Dr. Andrew Snelling who's pointed out the existence of fission tracks and radio halos.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he's pointed out that there has been a lot of decay, but clearly it's happened in a way that's been accelerated. And another thing he's pointed out, for instance, you've got different rocks. I mean, the same rock has been dated with different radioactive dating methods, and they give different dates.
Right.
But this is consistent if you have some episode of accelerated decay that accelerates the long-lived isotopes more than the short-lived isotopes, and the alpha more than the beta. So it seems like there's a pattern there which seems to fit whatever's causing accelerated decay is working in a pattern that seems to be consistent throughout everything that's been measured.
They try to say that isochron dating makes up for that, though, and that's irrefutable.
Isochron dating is supposed to take into account the initial composition, initial isotopic composition. But Dr. Snelling years ago, 20 plus years ago, and also Dr. Taz Walker in his honors geology project, he could actually find isochron plots with non-radioactive isotopes. So it means that the isochron lines they're finding they're not caused by radioactive decay over time, because he could do it with non-radioactive isotopes.
Ah, that's awesome.
So it means there's some sort of chemical fractionation process that's going on there, which maybe have nothing to do with radioactive decay, because he's getting it in non-radioactive isotopes. And since you guys like Lord of the Rings, though, it's a Lord of the Rings connection I can make here too.
Yeah.
Now you know what Mount Doom is, right?
Of course, yeah.
Well, you know the real live mountain in New Zealand is called Ngauruhoe. It's a mountain in the middle of the North Island. It's a real live mountain there. I've seen it personally many times. Okay, you see what they did is they got some lava flows they knew happened in the 50s. They know the date of a lava flow, and so 50 years later they did radioactive dating method tests on with this lava flow of known age, and they were getting dates of millions and even billions of years, even though they know the lava, the rock was formed only 50 years before.
I find that to be so funny, because why in the world then, Dr. Sarfati, would we trust these dating methods if many of them, as you're pointing out here, can't even give accurate dates for rocks of unknown age? But then apparently we're supposed to trust these dating methods for rocks of unknown age. Exactly, yeah. So that's the real science would say, well, let's see if we can test this on something we know and see if it works. And clearly it does not work. So therefore, to use it for something we don't know, I'd rather trust the eyewitness account of the Bible than these dating methods that fail in places where we can test them. Amen. Amen. Great point. So I find it amazing that based on everything we're talking about here in this portion of the interview, if radioisotope decay was accelerated as indicated by, say, the helium, the fission tracks, the radio halos, the findings of the rate team, and this occurred, say, during the Genesis flood, Dr. Sarfati, then realistically, these radioisotope decay clocks could never actually be relied upon when they do, say, date, quote unquote, rocks as, say, millions and billions of years. That's a problem. I think they couldn't be. Right. I've constantly heard this. This just kind of came to mind because in light of all this evidence for rapid nuclear decay, say during the flood, they want to just ignore that evidence and then point out that the flood itself would have generated too much heat, and then that heat would have boiled the earth or boiled the oceans. But then they're not willing to explain the evidence for like rapid accelerated decay. It's clearly occurred, like you said, Dr. That's Sarfati. The thing. I mean, there may be some things which are still not having been fully answered, like the heat problems with some flood models. But the point is, when evolutionists are faced with a problem they haven't got a clue about answering, like the origin of first life, they always say, well, let us, this is what science is about. It's about solving problems. In that case, the same allowance has to be given to creation. So if we have a problem that's not yet solved, then yeah, give us a chance to solve them. That's what you demand for yourselves. I mean, they don't give up on their materialism when they can't possibly explain origin of first life. And yeah, we're supposed to give up creation because we haven't explained everything about the heat model, the heat production of some of these things. The double standards are rife there. Exactly. And that's what came to mind was the double standard based on what we were talking about. Plus, when it comes to the so-called heat problem anyways, when you're thinking about a global flood, and I guess we can move on to that topic, the massive amounts of water that was on the earth at the time of the flood would have, I would imagine, taken up a lot of that radiation and heat. I mean, it sounds like they're almost making assumptions on the impact of the flood itself with their arguments. Well, I mean, I think they're trying to get it. They think that even the flood might have done it, but I think there's still too many unknowns about what could have happened. I think there are some, even though I think the flood was largely a natural thing, but I think it doesn't mean there weren't any miracles going on during the flood. Right. I mean, we try not to overdo that. Because I think there's a lot of natural processes going on, but I think some things are going on. It's certainly something God had used as a method of judgment. So I'm not ruling out miraculous things. I just try not to invoke it if I can help it. Amen.